Hi guys, Mr. Davis here. This is the second of our lessons on the musculoskeletal system. And the first task I've got for you today is just following up on what we were doing in the last lesson. So for the following slides, can you identify the joint action at the specified location in the images which follow? And then there's a final task as part of this starter to do with planes and axes. Okay, so as we go through each one, just pause on the slide, read through the information, write down your answer, and then halfway through the slide, I will reveal what the correct answer is. So the first one, joint action at the right hip, the right knee, and the right ankle, please. Pause the video here, record your answer, and then press play to continue. Okay, so the joint actions, the right hip, that is hyperextension. So if you look at that right hip area, it's moving backwards. That's an increase in the angle of the joint beyond 180 degrees here. Right knee, that is flexion. So that's a decrease in the angle of the joint. And then the right ankle is plantar flexion. It's the pointing of the toes away from the knee. Make any corrections you need to do before moving on, please. And the second example. So the joint action at the left elbow, the left shoulder, and the right elbow, please. Pause the video here to record your answers and then continue when you're ready. So the joint action at the left elbow, that is extension, increase in angle at the joint. The left shoulder here is abduction. So abduction is movement away from the midline of the body. And then the right elbow is flexion, decrease in the angle at a joint. Make any corrections you need to do before moving on. Okay, on this example, joint action at the elbow. And in this example, this is how you're more likely to have in an exam. Two images, and it's the movement from one to the other. So it's the elbow. Obviously, it's the same on both sides, from A to B. The joint action at the shoulder from A to B, and then the joint action from the shoulder from B going back to A. Pause the video here, record your answers, and then get ready to check the answers shortly. Okay, so the joint action at the elbow from A to B is flexion. So you can see here from a straight position, the arm's now bent at the elbow. That's a decrease in the angle of the joint. That's flexion. Second one. So this is a new term for A-level PE. This is horizontal abduction. So if you look at the shoulder from A to B, from having the arms up out in front of them, they've dropped back parallel to the ground. That is horizontal abduction. And it's the opposite for part C of this question. So shoulder action from B to A. So if he's lifting the weight up, the arms are out parallel to the ground and then they're pushing forward. So lifting the bar up, that is horizontal adduction. Make any corrections you need to before moving on, please. And then on this one, joint action at the left ankle, the right hip, the right knee, the right shoulder, and the left elbow. Pause the video here to record your answers before we move on. And the joint action, so left ankle, plantar flexion here, pointing of the toes away from the knee. The right hip, so here that hip is being driven forwards, it's a decrease in an angle at the joint, that is flexion. The right knee, clearly come up there, that's a decrease in the angle of the joint, it's also flexion. The right shoulder here, so you can see that's an increase in the angle of the joint beyond 180 degrees. So that's gone further past 180, that's gone backwards. That's a hyperextension of the shoulder. And then the left elbow here, flexion, decrease in the angle of a joint. Make any corrections before we move on, please. And then the last ones are just to do with planes and axes. So another topic that we just looked at in the last lesson. So what are the planes and axes involved in A, the cartwheel, B, the discus throw, and C, the long jump? Pause the video here to record your answers. Okay, so for the cartwheel, frontal plane and sagittal axes. And remember what I said in the last lesson, what's the first thing that you need to do whenever you're given a question on planes and axes? Always look at the direction of the movement to start with. So the direction of the movement in a cartwheel is a sideways movement. Sideways movement is the second of the pairs. So just go through the rhyme. Remind me of what the rhyme is. Silly teachers force students to learn. Okay, that in itself might not mean an awful lot to you, but it is fairly memorable. Silly teachers is the first pair. Remember, the plane is the first bit. So S in silly signifies sagittal plane. T in teachers, transverse axes. On this one, this example, this is the force student. So the F for the first bit and the S for the second bit. Remembering the plane always comes first. So on the second example, the discus throw. So this is more of a rotational movement. Any rotational movements are the third ones in that sequence. So always then, once you've established the direction of the movement, go back to the rhyme. Which pair is it in the rhyme? Silly teachers force students to learn. To for transverse plane, learn for longitudinal axes. And then the final one, the long jump. What's the direction of the movement? The direction is forwards. Forwards or backwards is always the first in the pair of the rhyme. So silly teachers. S for silly, T for teachers, sagittal plane because the plane comes first in the pair, and then transverse axes. Okay. If you go down that route and apply that process, the whole topic becomes a whole lot easier. Okay. If that has proved tricky for you, please go back over the previous video. I know the terminology is difficult, but if you establish that process when you're looking at this type of question, it does become a lot easier. And the rhyme is absolutely crucial. As silly as it sounds, silly teachers force students to learn. That will help you get the marks for this type of question. So we move on to the second part of our movement analysis work. If you can make a note neatly of the title, the learning objective, and then the key words there, and I know there's a few of them, is absolutely essential as we move through this lesson and the next couple of lessons that you're familiar with those terms. So learning objective, to learn how muscles work to cause movement. And then as we go through these keywords, the agonist. So from GCSE, you should remember that that's the one that contracts. It's the one that's responsible for the movement. The antagonist. Now in GCSE terminology, we've learned that as just the one that relaxes. Let's go with the next level up in terms of how you phrase that, and let's go with the muscle that works in opposition. So the two muscles work together. The agonist is the one that contracts and is responsible for the movement. The antagonist is the one that works in opposition. That's a better phrase to use. So moving forward, please remember to use that phrase. Isotonic is where there's a movement involved and then crucially a change in muscle length. Isometric is the opposite. There is no movement. The muscles are still working. There's still a contraction, but there's no change in muscle length. You've got two different types of isotonic. You've got concentric and eccentric. Concentric is shortening of the muscle. Eccentric is lengthening of the muscle. In both phases, there's a change in muscle length, so they're both isotonic. We will go through all of this in far more detail moving forward, but just as a kind of refresher from hopefully what you remember from GCSE PE, that should stand you in good stead as we move through the next few slides. So just pause the video here, make sure you've got all of that information down nice and neat at the start, and then we will move on. So this is a sequence of sentences, and I'm hopeful that this is very straightforward for you, particularly if you've done GCSE PE, but it's important that you have this as the building blocks for the rest of the information that follows. So just read it through. I'm not going to read it all through now, but just read through the statements and try and work out what the missing word is in the statements and make a note of it. I know this is the kind of the very basics of this topic, but it's important that this is crystal clear as we move forward. Okay, so pause the video here, fill in the blanks. I'll give you a few clues in a minute, and then we'll establish what the correct statements are. So here are your clues. So again, just pause the video for a minute. Just make sure that those words are words that you've managed to fit into those statements. If you need to rejig them around and edit what you've written, then please do so. Just like I said, pause the video, complete those statements, and then we'll move on. Okay, so let's just go through it nice and clearly. Muscles work in pairs. So when there's a contraction, when there's movement, or if there's no movement, but there is a contraction, muscles work in pairs. They always pull against the bones to create movement. Okay, that's how movement occurs. Now, it can be that there's a contraction and there's no movement, and we'll look at that later on. For the most part, in terms of how muscles work to create sporting movements, they work in pairs. And we'll get into some of the more detailed aspects of that shortly, but that's crucial. A pair of muscles in the arms. So we've got here biceps and triceps, pair of muscles in the legs, hamstrings, and quadriceps. The contracting muscle, as we said on the last slide, what's the name of the contracting muscle? That is the agonist, otherwise known as the prime mover. And the muscle which works in opposition, we may have learnt this previously as the muscle which relaxes, is the antagonist. The process is known as antagonistic. Oh, I've got that the wrong way around. Antagonistic muscle contraction. So that's what the whole process is called, antagonistic muscle contraction. And the key element here is that one muscle is contracting and working, and the other one is working in opposition to control and coordinate the movement. Okay, so make sure that you've got all of those statements correct, edit it if you need to, and then we will move on. Okay, so on this one, we're just going to look at one or two slightly more detailed examples just to make sure that you understand how that process works. I've kept this at the top just to kind of remind you of the key aspects here in terms of which one is the agonist and which one is the antagonist. Okay, and I'd like us to look at elbow flexion. So for instance, the upward phase of a bicep curl, and this is your task. So using a bicep curl as an example, concentrating just on the flexion stage, so the stage where you're bending the arm, lifting the weight up. Can you explain the role of the agonist and the antagonist during that process of muscular contraction? What I'd also like you to do is include the names of any relevant bones or joints in your explanation. Pause the video here, try and complete that answer in as much detail as you can, and then we'll move on and clarify what the correct answer is. Okay, so we'll go straight into it, and I'll just read it through. So elbow flexion. So in elbow flexion, so you're bending the arm at the elbow, you're raising that weight up in a bicep curl, raising the hand towards the shoulder. That's what flexion at the elbow is. And the elbow joint is a type of hinge joint. The agonist is the biceps, so they contract to start the movement. During that phase, the antagonist, the triceps, they work in opposition to allow the movement to happen. So they support the biceps to coordinate and control the movement. The biceps and the triceps are either side of the humerus. So this is where we're bringing in knowledge of the skeletal system. Humerus is the bone that connects shoulder down towards the elbow. The radius and the ulna are the two bones that essentially form the forearm from your elbow meeting up towards your wrist. So the biceps and triceps, either side of the humerus at the upper part of the arm, and then the radius and ulna in the lower part of the arm, they are the articulating bones. They're the ones that move during elbow flexion. Just make sure that you've got that clearly noted down. Go through it again carefully if that doesn't make sense. So this is one of the more basic examples, and it's really important that you get to grips with this. Okay, the second one, let's just break it down a little bit. So now we're looking at the kicking of a football. So just to ease our way in, which the pair of the muscles in the legs is involved in this process. So hopefully we're thinking hamstrings and quadriceps straight away. Now there's two phases to this process. Remember, kicking a football, to draw your leg back first, and then you swing it forward and straighten it. So which muscles are the agonist and which ones are the antagonist during that back lift phase? And then which ones are the agonist and which one's the antagonist for that swinging forward, that extension phase? Okay, so the hamstrings during the back lift, they are the agonist. They are the one that's contracting and working and responsible for that movement, that bending of the knee there. The quadriceps then are the antagonists, so it's always just the opposite. Quadriceps are relaxing or they're working in opposition as the hamstrings are contracting. If you do that now, if you stand up, slowly swing your leg backwards as if you're preparing to kick a football, place your hand on the back of your legs, and you'll probably feel some tension there. That is the hamstrings contracting. It's quite an uncomfortable position to hold. Quite simply, when you swing the leg forward, it's just the opposite way round. The hamstrings become the antagonist, and the quadriceps are the ones that are contracting and responsible for the movement. So as you bring that leg forward and extend it, so essentially you're straightening it. So if you pull your toes up now and straighten your leg, put your hands on the front of your leg, you'll probably feel a slight contraction at the upper part of the leg. That's where the quadriceps are contracting. Now, what we need to do is build that into an answer similar to the one that we had in the previous slide. So knee flexion, let's just look at this phase to begin with. So from here, where it's straight, to here, where there's a decrease in the angle at the joint. Same task, explain the role of the agonist and the antagonist when preparing to kick a football. Include the names of the relevant bones and joints in your explanation. So based on the structure and the detail that was required in the previous slide, can you pause the video here and complete your answer for this question? And we'll go through the details here. So in the back lift, that is flexion at the knee. The knee is also a hinge joint. The agonist are the hamstrings. They're contracting to start the movement. They're responsible for that back lift of the leg. Antagonist, the quadriceps, working in opposition to allow the movement to happen. And then crucially, we'll add in this information about the skeletal system. So the hamstrings and quadriceps are either side of the femur. So the femur is this big bone here that runs down from your hip to your knee. The tibia and fibula, what's the name of the bones that actually are moving here? What's the name given to those bones that move? Yeah, so they are the articulating bones. The tibia, which is your main shin bone, and your fibula is the one that just runs down alongside it. In this example here, they're moving there where you're bending that knee back. Okay, so they are the articulating bones and they move up towards the gluteals, which are in your bum. Okay, make sure you've got that nice and clear before we move on. Okay, what I'd like you to do is, there's going to be quite a lot. This table goes beyond just this slide, okay? So if you could just create a basic table. You don't need this part that goes down here, but this will just help you identify the muscles or the area of the body where the muscles are working and relaxing. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go through each one of them. I'm going to give you a bit of time to try and put the table together. Then on these ones, which I'm hopeful GCSE students should be fairly familiar with, I'll give you a little clue and then I'll reveal the answers. And then as we get to some of the more complex sections of the musculoskeletal system, I'm just going to go through that information with you. So pause the video here, see if you can work out what the right answers are. For example, flexion at the elbow. We've already looked at that one on the previous couple of slides. Which one is the agonist? Which muscle is the agonist during flexion of the elbow? Which muscle is the antagonist? Which one is paired up with the one that's working here, but is working in opposition to help coordinate and control the movement? If you could do that all the way through, so for example, just so we're clear, I'm going to write it, although my writing is going to be terrible with this funny little pen. flexion, the agonist of biceps. The antagonist will be the triceps. Now, if you remember what I said about just the opposite movement during extension, so the straighten of the elbow, the opposite here be the triceps, and then working in opposition to that would be the biceps. Okay, so I want you to complete the table like that as we move through each of these examples. Pause the video here and try and have a go at that. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go and provide you with the correct names of the muscles in each section, and then you've got to work out which of those two muscles is the agonist and which of those two muscles is the antagonist in each section of the body. So pause the video there, just make sure that your answers reflect that information before we move on. Okay, so for this section, you can just self-check your own work with a purple pen, tick it if you have it correct, or write in the correct name, put the correction in a purple pen if you have made an error. So biceps and triceps. Biceps are the agonist during elbow flexion, triceps the antagonist. We said that one already. That's the opposite. So you just switch it around. So biceps here. See how that just changes. So once you've established what one is, you should find it quite straightforward to get the other one correct. We'd also done flexion of the knee on the previous slide. So again, it's just swapping it over. Right, now things become a little bit more difficult. So during flexion at the hip, so remember that's essentially bringing that leg up and in front of you, decreasing the angle at the joint, at the hip joint. For flexion of the hip, that's bringing that that leg up in front. Remember, it's not based on what's happening below the knee. It's based on that hip area there. So just driving that knee up, you're closing that angle at the joint of the hip. Now, for this one, whilst that concept might be a little alien to you, the actual name of the muscles is quite useful here. The hip flexors are the agonist in flexion at the hip. So that should be a fairly straightforward one to remember. And if the hip flexors are at the front, probably makes sense that the gluteals, so the muscles at the backside, are going to be the ones that are paired up and working in opposition. And as soon as you know that, you should be able to get the other ones. So there is just the opposite. Crucially, what we've added in here is this idea of hyperextension at the hip as well. So extension brings it back down towards 180 degrees. If you then pull that hip or pull that leg back further as if you're trying to prepare to kick a football, that's hyperextension. Same agonist and antagonist for extension and hyperextension at the hip. Okay, plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. Hopefully what we've got here is the gastrocnemius. It's the muscle that's the agonist, the working muscle, the one that's responsible for the movement during plantar flexion. So that's like pointing of the toes as if you're going to volley a football or come up onto the balls of your feet. And then the tibialis anterior. So those are the muscles that run essentially down your shin, the opposite, the front of the leg. So these are at the back, these are at the front. When you come up onto your tiptoes, if you stayed there for 30 seconds or so, you should feel it down the back of your lower part of your leg. That's the gastrocnemius. Tibialis anterior are relaxing, or they're working in opposition. As soon as you know that, you should be able to get these ones. It's just the opposite. Okay, make sure that your answers reflect that before we move on. Right, I'm going to just go through these because the terms are going to be fairly new to us, I would imagine. So abduction and adduction at the hip. Okay, just have a think about what that movement looks like. So abduction is taken away, so it's movement away. So if you look at the little man up here, that would be the hips coming up and out here. Adduction is bringing them back. You're adding it in to the midline of the body. So during abduction, when those that hip is moving out to the side as if you're doing, for example, a side step or something like that, the adductors are the agonist. Now the adductors, if you take a look at this diagram down here, there's three that you need to be aware of. Okay, so you've got the brevis, longus, and the magnus. Now, whilst the terminology might be a little bit tricky just to get your your head around initially, what will help is the fact that, well, I think it helps me remember it. They're essentially use the first letter. They're in alphabetical order as they work their way down. So it's kind of your inner thigh area. So if you bring that hip out, it's these, crucially, it's these muscles, these adductor muscles that are going to be working, contracting. Now, working in opposition to that, as a pair, is this. Now, you can refer to it as the TFL, but I think you're probably better off in an exam answer, so in your main exam, using the full proper name. Okay, and that is the tensor fasciae latae. TFL is this muscle that runs down here. Okay. In addition to that, you've also got these muscles, your gluteals. But for this one, rather than saying gluteals, you just need to be a little bit more specific. Okay. Probably familiar with this one in the middle, gluteus maximus. You've also got gluteus medius, gluteus minimus. So it goes medius at the top, maximus in the middle, the biggest one, then minimus is the smallest one down at the bottom. Okay, all of those muscles work in opposition to the adductors during abduction of the hip. So when you're moving that hip out, abductors are the agonist, and you need to name the three muscles there, and then the tensor fasciae latae and the gluteus medius, gluteus minimus are the ones that are the agonist, the antagonist. What I strongly recommend you do, in addition to the table, just have a little, a little diagram. Doesn't have to be massively detailed, but something that just shows where the adductors are, where the TFL is, and then the breakdown of these three gluteal muscles here, obviously labeling them. So it's not an art lesson, obviously, but having these diagrams will help you remember them. And then once you've got it established for essentially one part of the movement going out, that's abduction. Adduction is coming back in, and all that happens is they just switch over. Okay, so the TFL, gluteus medius and minimus, they become the agonists, the ones that are contracting. The adductors become the antagonist. Okay, pause the video here, make sure that is clear in your head. I know some of the terminology is a bit of a tongue twister, but make sure that you've got clear notes on where those muscles are and what their role is in that type of movement before we move on. Okay, you have also got, in terms of the hip, horizontal abduction and horizontal adduction. Now take a look at the agonist and antagonist here. What do you notice? They are the same. They are the same agonist and antagonist as on the previous slide. Okay, you just got to make sure that you get the order right. So during horizontal abduction, the adductor, so that is the hip's gone out and then it's moving backwards. That's abduction. Horizontal adduction, the hips come out to the side and then you're bringing it round to the front of your body. That's horizontal adduction, a bit like open and closing the gate during a warm-up. Okay, the movement forward is horizontal adduction. The movement backwards, so you're opening up that gate, is horizontal abduction. Again, it's the same muscles, so you don't need to draw those diagrams again, but you do need to make sure that it's nice and clear in your table, and make a note of the fact that it's the same muscles that are involved. Okay, so horizontal abduction is the same as just abduction. It's just the same thing. Okay, take a look. Take a look. It's the same muscles. Make sure that that's clear in your notes. We then move on to the shoulder. Okay, so different muscles. Because of the nature of the shoulder, it's a ball and socket joint. So it's a wider range of motion. So there are more, or there are different joint actions that are going to be possible there compared to just a normal hinge joint, which allows which two types of joint action? Flexion extension. So flexion extension still happen at a ball and socket joint, but there are others as well. For now, we'll just look flexion extension, but remember, we're also looking at hyperextension, so increasing the angle of a joint beyond 180 degrees. And again, I'm just going to go through this information with you here is slightly more straightforward than the last one, but I just want to make it crystal clear. So you've got a good set of notes, and then you're able to use that in sporting examples. So shoulder flexion, that is essentially from having your hands down by your side, bringing that straight arm up in front of you. That is shoulder flexion, bringing the straight arm up in front of you. The agonist, the working muscle, take a look. AD, what might that mean? So that is in your shoulder. You're familiar with the deltoids in your shoulder. Deltoids, there's more than one of them. Now, the anterior deltoid, I know it's a little bit tricky to see. Anterior is the front deltoid. So put your hand on the front of your shoulder as you move your arm up and in front of you. You should feel that muscle contracting. Yeah, that is the anterior deltoid. The antagonist, the one that's working in opposition, is the latissimus dorsi. So that big muscle that runs down essentially the side of your back there. Okay, so if you see bodybuilders and weightlifters, they've got those big kind of wings, if you like, that is what your latissimus dorsi is. All that happens is it just switches over. So during extension, hyperextension of the shoulder, so extension, bringing that arm back down towards your side, and then if you continue to swing it backwards, so beyond 180 degrees, that's hyperextension, your latissimus dorsi becomes the agonist, and the anterior deltoid then becomes the antagonist. Okay, on the next one, we've got abduction and adduction. So abduction, what's abduction of the shoulder? Movement away from the midline of the body. Okay, so that's having your arms down by your side and moving it up and out away from the middle of your body. Now again, there are some tricky names that we've got to look at here for the muscles. So I'm just presenting this information for you as clearly as I can, so then you can apply this to sporting examples later on. So abduction, movement away from the midline of the body instead of the anterior deltoid. Again, if you put your hand on the side of your shoulder, that is the middle deltoid or the medial deltoid, the one here. Okay, so it's that muscle plus this one here, the supraspinatus. Okay, those two work together as the agonist. Now this is essentially where your scapula is on your back. Okay, and again, there's different names of muscles here. This one here, this is supraspinatus. Bit of a mouthful, say it a few times. Try and get your head around how it might be spelled. Supraspinatus, supraspinatus, supraspinatus. Say it with me. Supraspinatus, and your medial deltoid. In opposition to that, PD. What might PD be? Take a look at the different diagrams. PD is your posterior. Posterior is an old school name for the back. Anterior is the front. Medial is the middle. Posterior is the back. So this one towards the back of your shoulder. Okay. So posterior deltoid and your latissimus dorsi that are working in opposition during abduction. So movement away. When you're moving that arm back down towards the midline of your body, that is shoulder adduction. You're adding it into the midline of your body, and all that's happened is they've switched over again. So your posterior deltoid and your latissimus dorsi become your agonist, ones that are contracting to control and are responsible for that movement. So if you have your arms up, out to the side, and then you bring them down towards the side, a bit like a kind of bodybuilding action, showing off your big, strong chest muscles. It's your posterior deltoid and your latissimus dorsi that are working there. And then your medial or middle deltoid and your supraspinatus that are working in opposition as the antagonist. I've just put the abbreviations in here just because I couldn't fit the full wording in the box. Those abbreviations don't mean anything. Do not put them down like that in the exam. Okay, make sure you've got the full and correct spelling of each of those muscles. And moving forward, the only way you're going to get the mark in the exam is if you spelt those muscles correctly. Okay, go over it again Make sure that you're clear with the pronunciation of them, because that will help you, one, remember it, and two, be able to spell it. So go over it. Generally spend a few minutes just going over it. Get it clear in your head. What's the anterior deltoid? What's the medial deltoid? What's the posterior deltoid? Latissimus dorsi. What's the supraspinatus? Make sure you are clear on those terms. Okay, and then we're looking at horizontal adduction of the shoulder. So horizontal adduction of the shoulder. Take a second to think about what that movement looks like. So adduction, movements coming back towards the midline of the body. So if you raise your arms up and out to the side and then bring them back in front of you, a bit like you're kind of doing a bit of a Superman action, but straight out in front of you instead of up above your head. That's the action from the side, parallel to the ground, moving in front of you. That's horizontal adduction of the shoulder. And it's your pectoral muscles that are the agonists there. The ones that are working in opposition are the latissimus dorsi. Okay, so again, make sure that you've got the full spelling correct. And as with all of them, they just switch over. Horizontal abduction. So if you hold your arms directly out in front of you at kind of chest height, and then you bring them back to the side, still keeping them parallel to the ground, so don't drop them down. That is horizontal abduction. Latissimus dorsi is the agonist, the ones that are responsible for that movement, and your pectorals are the ones that are relaxing or that are working in opposition to help coordinate and control the movement. Okay, what I'd like to do just to finish up with is to complete this task for me. So we looked at a couple of really basic examples of elbow flexion and knee flexion earlier on. Now use those two examples as a guide. And what I'd like you to do is select a sporting example. So for instance, before we had a bicep curl for elbow flexion and we had a preparation phase of kicking a football for knee flexion. I want you to think of other examples from different sports to try and explain the joint action of your choice from the remaining key joints. So essentially we've done a joint action at the elbow, we've done a joint action at the knee. I now want you to do one for the shoulder, one for the hip, and one for the ankle. I say one, do at least one, okay? At the ball and socket joints, so the shoulder and hip, there are lots of different examples that you could pick, okay? You could have shoulder flexion, you could have shoulder extension, you could have hip hyperextension, you could have adduction and adduction, you could have horizontal adduction, and then when it comes to the ankle, plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. So I'm saying do at least one for the shoulder, the hip, and the ankle. But you know, once you've got your head around this, I don't think that should take you that long to do. So it might be worth investing a bit of time, particularly if you've got time left in the lesson, to add other examples, other sporting examples, other techniques and movements from other sports. Be very clear what that technique and what phase of the movement is. So don't just say, on the previous example, I didn't say, you know, doing a bicep curl. I said the upward phase of lifting the weight on a bicep curl. I didn't say kicking a football. I said it was the preparation phase of kicking a football. So be very clear what the phase of the movement is that you've chosen to focus on. And then also with each example, include the names of the relevant bones and joints in each example, just like we did on the previous examples for elbow and knee flexion. Okay, so tell me what the type of joint is, tell me what the articulating bones are. Okay, spend a bit of time doing that. Make sure you got your head around the different types of movement, the different joint actions, the different agonists and antagonists, and we will take it on a step further in our next lesson. Okay, just to be clear, that's a breakdown of the information that I want for each of those examples, at least 3 more examples. Okay, if you're really feeling on it, you can identify the plane and the axes involved in the movements. I know that we've not done that on the previous examples, but we have looked at planes and axes, and it does link in directly to movements, joint actions, and it's something that you have to really get your head around, because it might be that you get a type of question like that in the exam, which asks you to detail that sort of information. Okay, have a go at it, and we will review your answers in the next lesson. Okay, cheers guys, all the best.